Everybody wants cinematic footage, and in true social media fashion, because 3 people have asked me, David, how do you color grade your footage? I decided to make this 2-part series detailing first in this video how I set up my camera, my Canon R6 Mark II in C-Log 3 to get the best footage out of it. And then in a second video, I'm gonna detail my step-by-step process about how I color grade my footage and ultimately making your own power grade in Davinci Resolve. My name is David J. Orozco, and I'm a professional photographer, filmmaker, content creator. And these are 6 keys of how I set up my Canon R6 Mark II, with a bonus tip at the very end, because you can set up your camera with all the best settings, but if you don't know how to use it or how to move it, then it's gonna negate all of that. So let's just dive straight into it. Number 1 is the lens. And for me particularly, I use 95% of the time my Canon EF 24-70 2.8 version 2L lens. And this is an EF lens, and you're like, David, wait, there's RF lenses that are out. Yes, I know. However, I prefer the EF lenses because, well, in truth, I'm not made of money and I already own these EF lenses. However, even so, the EF lenses have this organic softness to them that I really love. And on top of that, you can control the focus mechanically. And so because of those 2 things, I really like the EF lenses. RF lenses are great and you can still use them and they'll give you kind of a little bit of a different look. For photo, I think that look is great. The tack sharpness is kind of what you want for photo, but for video, that's not necessarily what I'm looking for. I'm looking for more of an organic softness to it that is pleasing to the eye. I still get great autofocus with the Canon adapter, and so that's not an issue for me. And then I can always flick it over into manual focus and control the focus mechanically in the lens. Piggybacking off of this is the variable ND filter. Should you use one? And the answer is yes, you should. In the beginning, I did not use a variable ND filter, or I was kind of lax about that. These days, I do think that you should use a variable ND filter because it allows you to maintain both the shutter speed that you want and the native ISO, which I will talk about in detail later. Think of them as sunglasses for your camera. The specific variable ND filter that I use is the Polar Pro Peter McKinnon 2 to 5 stop VND. That's a mouthful, with mist. Now the mist portion also helps to soften the edges. I'm using it right now and I think it warms the skin a little bit in a very pleasing way and just softens the edges as well, which kind of leads to that really organic cinematic look. Arguably, the most important thing is the quality that you're filming in and whether it's 8-bit or 10-bit. And again, in my early days, I didn't really like to film in 4K because A, the file sizes were huge and the efficiency of the codecs were just not there yet. However, these days with storage being as relatively cheap as it is, both in SD cards and in archival storage, SSDs and hard drives, I think that you should be shooting in 4K. I tend to shoot in 4K unless it's completely unreasonable. And completely unreasonable to me would be like, I'm recording a 3-hour seminar and they don't need 4K. I could get by with 1080. So the punchline here is that 4K 24, 4K 60 and the Canon R6 Mark II are what I use really like 90% of the time. However, I think more importantly is 10-bit. If you have access to 10-bit files, shoot 10-bit. There's no reason to not shoot 10-bit because it allows you so much more color flexibility, and the files and the video files themselves are just more malleable and able to be pushed and pulled in different ways regarding color. This segues perfectly into shooting log. You should be shooting log, and on my R6 Mark II, it's gonna be C-Log 3, and most of the prosumer and consumer models of Canon, it's gonna be C-Log 3. Now maybe you have the R5 Mark II or a cinema camera, then you're gonna be shooting either in RAW or in C-Log 2. But for the rest of us, C-Log 3 I think works well, and it's worked well for me in all of my footage. A log profile is just a flat, colorless, low contrast file where it's gonna spit it out and you're gonna be like, man, this looks like crap. All of that is intentional to preserve as much data and as much dynamic range in the file as possible to then take it into an editor like Davinci Resolve, which is what I use, and to then get the most out of that footage. Now, on top of this, you have to specify the color space. The options that you'll get are BT709, BT2020, and Canon Cinema Gamut. Choose Canon Cinema Gamut. I love the color that produces, and it's just worked well for me. I mentioned earlier about using a variable ND filter, and this is one of the reasons why, the 180-degree shutter rule. All that this says is if you take your frame rate, so say I'm shooting in 4K 24 and you double it, so 24 frames per second doubled is 48. So 1/48 would be my ideal shutter speed to adhere to this rule. Now in mirrorless cameras, the closest thing we have to that is 1/50th of a second. And that would be the shutter speed you'd want to keep in order to maintain organic motion as we see it with our own eyes, or at least as close to it as we can get. So another example would be 60 frames per second. You double that to get to 120. 1/125th of a second would be the shutter speed that you would use. The variable ND filter helps us to maintain this, especially in bright settings. Now the second reason to use a variable ND filter would be to preserve the native or base ISO of the log profile. Most log profiles come with a native ISO. For C-Log3, it's gonna be ISO 800. And what that means is that at that ISO, you're gonna get the best quality, you're gonna preserve the most dynamic range out of that particular file, assuming you expose it well. As a bonus here, you wanna expose C-Log3 probably a stop to a stop and 3/4 over. You can use the back LCD. I know this is like blasphemy in that I would say this and advise this to people, but I found the Canon LCDs are roughly close in approximating exposure. If you go to when you set up your log profile, you turn on the view assist, now it'll automatically kind of convert that image on the back of the screen. And so you can get a good approximation of where's my exposure at. Now, if you're in a super controlled setting, you're on a production and you're with a crew, there's no need to do this. You'll have your camera fitted out with a monitor. You'll maybe have an even external monitor in a video village of some sort, and you'll have all the exposure tools that you need to really nail the exposure. But for solo shooters like myself, or maybe I'm traveling, you can use the back LCD to approximate the exposure. Unofficially, I've seen information that says that ISO 3200 also offers a lower noise floor and may be a second base ISO in the Canon R6 Mark II. This is information that I haven't scientifically tested, but I found good results in using either ISO 800 or ISO 3200 and really sticking to those two. The bonus here, which I think is arguably more important, is camera movement and motivated camera movement in making your footage look even more cinematic. And so what does that mean? Well, motivated camera movement is just camera movement with a purpose. There is intentionality behind it. Maybe there is someone walking into my frame, and as they walk into frame on frame right towards the left, I pan with them slowly. And that person then leads us to this beautiful view in Yosemite. And we end our shot there. And so we've used this person and the movement that they've had to bring us to the payoff, which is this beautiful landscape. That's motivated, intentional movement of a camera. And that's really what I think elevates footage from just being run-of-the-mill footage to cinematic footage. Using things like mimicking slider movements left to right or right to left, or panning up and down. Those types of movements with intentionality behind them are gonna make your footage look cinematic. Now, with this comes, well, how do I stabilize my camera? Because the moment that you try this, you're gonna be like, well, my footage looks shaky. There are two ways that I go about stabilizing footage with just the camera. Either one, I turn off all in-body image stabilization and stabilize in post. I typically do this mostly for static shots. The second option that still works well is using the in-body image stabilization. Now I know you're like, David, what? You've made videos that literally are titled, "It's a deal breaker." And in some ways it is, but there are ways that you can move around this and navigate around it to still get usable, good footage. So I will turn on the in-body image stabilization, the mechanical stabilization, along with the digital stabilization in just the standard mode, not the enhanced. And then that tends to work well with slider shots left to right or panning shots up and down. For whatever reason, at weddings, you'll always see relatives like this with their iPhone, iPad kind of thing. We do not want that. You want elbows in tight to your sides, cameras close to you here, really like center of body is best. You're gonna bend your knees a little bit, and then from this point here, I have two hands, one on the literal grip of the camera, and then my other underneath the barrel of the lens. And then from here, I'm just literally gonna lean slowly left and right. Just slow measured movements. And then for panning up and down, same thing, knees bent, grip is still the same. I'm not moving at my wrists, I'm moving my whole body to do this. So I'm just gonna kind of stand up and lean back. Same thing for coming down. Super easy. That's I think the most efficient way for camera movement when you're not using a gimbal or anything like that. You just have the camera. So really in the X axis or the Y axis, which is up and down, but not in the Z axis, which translates forward and backward. The moment that you start to move forward or backward with image stabilization turned on is when you're gonna see the wobble in the corners, and that makes the footage, I think, unusable. Obviously, you could use things like a gimbal when appropriate, but oftentimes as a solo shooter or just traveling, like it's just me and the camera. And so you can stabilize yourself, use the in-body image stabilization along with these intentional movements and really get the most out of your footage. That's it for part 1 of this series. I hope that these 6 key things, along with intentional motivated movement and how image stabilization interplays in that, help you to get a great start into getting cinematic looking footage. In the next video, I'm gonna detail out how I then take that footage and color grade it in Davinci Resolve. I hope this has helped. My name is David J. Orozco, and I will catch you in the next one. Peace. What's the most famous pose? This is advanced camera movement, like camera movement 301.